The morning mist hung thick over the Tennessee River Valley like a burial shroud, and Colonel John Wilder felt death in the air. It was September 18th, 1863, and something was terribly wrong. His mounted infantry had been probing the dense Georgia woods south of Chattanooga for days, catching glimpses of gray uniforms moving like phantoms through the Cumberland foothills. What they discovered would shake the very foundations of the Union, 'cause General William Rosecrans had been feeling invincible. His Army of the Cumberland had just executed one of the war's most brilliant maneuvers, forcing Confederate General Braxton Bragg to abandon Chattanooga without firing a shot. The newspapers back in Washington were calling it a masterpiece of strategy, comparing Rosecrans to Napoleon himself. But pride, as the general would soon learn, often comes before the fall. Bragg had not retreated in defeat, he had withdrawn by design. While Rosecrans celebrated his bloodless victory and scattered his 3 corps across a 40-mile front in pursuit of what he believed to be a demoralized enemy, the Confederate commander was orchestrating the largest concentration of Southern forces in the Western theater. Reinforcements were pouring in from across the Confederacy. James Longstreet's veteran corps from Virginia, troops from Mississippi under William Walker, and Simon Buckner's divisions from East Tennessee. The stage was being set along Chickamauga Creek, a Cherokee word meaning river of death, a name that would prove prophetic. Wilder's scouts brought increasingly alarming reports throughout the day. Confederate camps stretched for miles along the creek's eastern banks. The sound of axes rang through the forest as Southern engineers built bridges and corduroyed roads. Most ominously, the distinctive whistle of arriving trains echoed from Ringgold and Dalton, carrying fresh battalions to swell Bragg's ranks. By nightfall, Rosecrans finally grasped the magnitude of his peril. His army was dangerously dispersed, with Major General Alexander McCook's 20th Corps stretched thin near Alpine, 25 miles south, while Major General Thomas Crittenden's 21st Corps held the approaches to Chattanooga. Only Major General George Thomas's 14th Corps maintained any semblance of concentration near Stevens Gap. As referenced in Harper's weekly coverage of the battle's aftermath, the Union commander's confidence had blinded him to the gathering Confederate storm. The magazine would later describe how General Rosecrans's brilliant maneuver had transformed from triumph to potential catastrophe in the span of mere days. Emergency orders went out in the darkness, calling the scattered Union forces to concentrate. Near Chickamauga Creek, exhausted soldiers stumbled through the night, following torchlit roads and mountain paths in a desperate race against time. The men sensed the urgency in their officers' voices, the barely controlled panic that spoke of mortal danger. Meanwhile, across the creek, Confederate campfires stretched like fallen stars through the Georgia pines. Bragg's army had swollen to nearly 68,000 men, the largest force he had ever commanded. Veterans of Gettysburg sharpened bayonets beside Mississippi farm boys who had never seen a major battle. The air thrummed with anticipation and the quiet preparations of war. The Cherokee had chosen their name for this creek well. By dawn, the river of death would begin to claim its due, and neither army would ever be the same. The battle that would follow would earn its place among the bloodiest encounters of America's bloodiest war. A 2-day nightmare that would shock a nation already grown numb to slaughter. As September 19th dawned gray and humid, the stage was set for carnage. Dawn broke sullen and oppressive on September 19th, with fog rising from Chickamauga Creek like the breath of some sleeping beast. Colonel Daniel McCook of the 52nd Ohio could barely see 20 yards ahead as his regiment moved through the tangled underbrush toward Reed's Bridge. What he didn't know was that Confederate Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson's division was moving toward the same objective from the opposite direction, setting the stage for the war's most accidental and devastating collision. The first shot rang out at approximately 7:30 in the morning. Private James Wilson of Company K thought he saw a gray uniform moving through the mist and fired instinctively. The bullet found its mark, dropping a Confederate skirmisher named Thomas Hartwell, making him perhaps the first casualty of what would become a two-day Holocaust. Within moments, the quiet Georgia morning exploded into chaos. Johnson's Confederates, advancing in 3 brigade columns, slammed into McCook's surprised Ohioans with the force of a thunderbolt. The Union soldiers, caught completely off guard while crossing a small clearing, scattered like quail before a hunter's gun. McCook himself fell within the first 5 minutes, a mini-ball shattering his collarbone and spinning him to the ground. His men, leaderless and confused, began a fighting withdrawal toward the Lafayette Road. The sound of battle carried across the creek like rolling thunder, alerting both armies that the dance of death had begun. General Thomas, known to his men as the Rock of Chickamauga, though he had not yet earned that sobriquet, immediately ordered his divisions forward to support the beleaguered Ohioans. Meanwhile, General Bragg, hearing the gunfire from his headquarters near Dalton, dispatched orders for a general advance all along his line. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but rather a series of vicious, disconnected fights as units stumbled into each other through the thick woods. The dense forest canopy blocked out most of the morning sun, creating an eerie twilight world where muzzle flashes provided the primary illumination. Men fired at shadows and sounds, often not knowing whether they were shooting at friends or enemies until it was too late. Brigadier General John Beatty's brigade rushed to support McCook's retreating Ohioans, but they too were caught in the Confederate tide. The 104th Illinois, pride of the Prairie State Volunteers, made a gallant stand in a small ravine, pouring devastating volleys into Johnson's advancing Tennesseans. For 20 minutes, the Illinois boys held their ground, their Springfield rifles creating a curtain of lead that no living thing could cross. But courage alone could not stem the Confederate flood. As reported in the Cincinnati commercial following the battle, the rebel advance came on with the fury of a mountain torrent, sweeping aside all resistance. Wave after wave of gray-clad soldiers emerged from the smoke, their rebel yells echoing through the forest like the cries of damned souls. By 9 o'clock, Thomas had committed his entire corps to the fight, but the Confederates kept coming. Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry struck the Union left flank like a hammer blow, his troopers dismounting to fight as infantry while their horses were led to the rear. The fighting grew so intense that in some places, opposing lines stood only 30 yards apart, blazing away at each other in a murderous exchange that left the ground carpeted with blue and gray bodies. Captain James Connolly of the 123rd Illinois would later write to his wife, "The roar of musketry was so continuous that individual shots could not be distinguished. It sounded like the tearing of some enormous piece of canvas, magnified 1,000 times." The morning's fighting had drawn both armies into a vortex of violence from which there could be no easy escape. What had begun as a reconnaissance had become a battle, and what had begun as a battle was rapidly becoming a slaughter. The river of death was beginning to flow in earnest, and the worst was yet to come. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, the true scale of the carnage became visible for the first time. By noon, the battle had spread like wildfire along a front stretching nearly 4 miles through the Georgia wilderness. The morning's sporadic fighting had evolved into a full-scale engagement that neither commanding general had intended, but both were now committed to seeing through to its terrible conclusion. The forest itself had become a participant in the fight. Slaughter, its thick canopy trapping gunsmoke until visibility dropped to mere yards, while fallen logs and rocky outcroppings channeled the fighting into deadly killing zones. General George Thomas had established his headquarters near the Kelly farmhouse, a modest log structure that would soon become the epicenter of the Union defense. From this vantage point, the veteran commander could hear the ebb and flow of battle through the trees, though he could see precious little of the actual fighting. Messengers arrived constantly, their uniforms torn and blackened with powder smoke, bringing reports that grew more desperate with each passing hour. The Confederate assault had gained momentum despite the morning's heavy casualties. General Daniel Harvey Hill's corps, fresh off the trains from Virginia, struck Thomas's center with devastating effect. The 21st Ohio, holding a slight ridge near the Brotherton Farm, found themselves facing 3 full Confederate brigades, advancing in echelon formation. Colonel Jesse Norton watched in fascination and horror as the gray lines emerged from the smoke like something from a medieval nightmare. Battle flags snapping in the humid air, officers on horseback waving their sabers and shouting encouragement to their men. "Fix bayonets!" Norton shouted, though his voice was nearly lost in the cacophony of battle. The Ohio boys responded with grim determination, their steel blades glinting in the filtered sunlight as they prepared to sell their lives dearly. The Confederate charge struck them with the force of an avalanche. Private William Shaw of Company D later described the moment of impact. "They came on yelling like demons, and when they hit our line, it was like 2 freight trains meeting head-on. Men were thrown backward by the force of it, and then it all became a hand-to-hand melee with bayonets, rifle butts, and even fists." The fighting along Thomas's front had devolved into something primal and savage. In a small clearing near the Vineyard Farm, the 35th Ohio found themselves surrounded and fighting for their very survival. Captain Charles Hunter rallied his company around the regimental colors, forming a hollow square as Confederate attackers pressed in from all sides. For 30 minutes, the surrounded Ohioans held their ground, their volleys creating a small island of blue in a sea of gray. Meanwhile, on the Union right, General Thomas Wood's division was being systematically destroyed by repeated Confederate assaults. The 6th Indiana, which had started the day with 450 men, was reduced to fewer than 100 effectives by 2 o'clock. Their colonel, Hagerman Tripp, had been carried from the field with a shattered leg, and their major lay dead beside the regimental standard. As documented in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the intensity of the fighting defied comprehension. Units were being chewed up and spit out by the forest's insatiable appetite for human sacrifice. The 15th Alabama lost 2/3 of its strength in a single charge against a Union battery, while the 9th Kentucky Union simply disintegrated under concentrated Confederate fire, its survivors streaming toward the rear in complete disorder. But perhaps nowhere was the fighting more intense than around the Brotherton cabin, where General James Longstreet was massing his corps for what he hoped would be the decisive blow. Old Pete, as his men called him, had arrived from Virginia with 8,000 veteran troops who had fought at Gettysburg just 2 months earlier. These were not raw recruits or militia, but hardened professionals who had survived the crucible of the Eastern Theater. Longstreet could sense opportunity in the chaos. Union resistance was fierce but clearly weakening, and he had detected what appeared to be a gap in the enemy line near the Brotherton Farm. If he could exploit that weakness with a concentrated assault, he might be able to split the Union Army in half and destroy it piecemeal. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the stage was being set for the most devastating single attack of the entire Civil War. The River of Death was about to become a torrent. The clock in the Brotherton farmhouse showed 1:15 when General James Longstreet received the intelligence that would change the course of American history. A Confederate scout, his uniform torn and bloodied from crawling through the underbrush, reported that he had discovered a quarter-mile gap in the Union line directly opposite Longstreet's position. General Thomas Wood's division had been pulled out of line to reinforce the Union left, but the movement had been poorly coordinated, leaving a fatal opening in the Federal defenses. Longstreet, the solid Georgian whom Robert Lee called his old warhorse, saw the opportunity immediately. Within minutes, he had assembled an assault force of 11,000 men, the largest concentrated attack formation of the entire battle. Brigadier General Jerome Robertson's Texas Brigade would lead the charge, followed by Evander Law's Alabamians and Micah Jenkins's South Carolinians. The plan was brutally simple: punch through the gap, split the Union Army, and roll up both flanks simultaneously. The men of Hood's old division, now under Law's command, had been waiting for this moment since dawn. These were veterans of 2nd Manassas, Sharpsburg, and Gettysburg soldiers who had faced the worst the Union Army could throw at them and survived. They checked their weapons one final time, adjusted their cartridge boxes, and prepared to write their names in blood across the pages of history. At exactly 1:30, Longstreet gave the signal. 3 long blasts from a bugle echoed through the forest, and 11,000 Confederate soldiers rose from their concealed positions and advanced toward the unsuspecting Union line. The sight was magnificent and terrible, a gray tide flowing through the green Georgia woods, battle flags streaming in the humid air, the ground trembling under thousands of marching feet. The first Union troops to see the approaching Confederate host were the pickets of the 77th Pennsylvania, posted near a small creek about 400 yards from the main Union line. Private Samuel Morrison would later write that the sight reminded him of a vast gray carpet being unrolled across the landscape, except this carpet was made of bayonets and rifle barrels that gleamed like deadly stars. The Pennsylvania boys fired a hasty volley and then ran for their lives, racing back toward their main line with the news that the entire Confederate Army seemed to be bearing down on them. But their warning came too late. Before the Union commanders could react, Longstreet's avalanche struck home. The impact was devastating beyond imagination. The Confederates hit the Union center like a sledgehammer striking glass, shattering 2 entire divisions in a matter of minutes. The 77th Pennsylvania simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit, its survivors scattered to the winds. The 21st Ohio, which had fought so gallantly all morning, was overrun and destroyed, its regimental colors captured by a young Alabama sergeant named William Crawford. General William Rosecrans himself nearly became a casualty of Longstreet's breakthrough. The Union commander was riding along the Dry Valley Road when the Confederate tide swept over the ridgeline above him. A Virginia sharpshooter's bullet knocked his hat clean off his head, while another round killed his horse and sent him tumbling into a roadside ditch. For several terrifying minutes, the commanding general of the Army of the Cumberland found himself crawling through the mud while Confederate soldiers streamed past on both sides. The breakthrough created panic throughout the Union ranks. Entire regiments began abandoning their positions without orders, convinced that the battle was lost. The 39th Indiana threw down their rifles and fled toward Chattanooga, spreading word that the army was being destroyed. Soon the retreat became a rout, with thousands of Union soldiers streaming northward in complete disorder. As referenced in Whitelaw Reid's contemporary reporting for the Cincinnati Gazette, the Confederate breakthrough had torn the heart out of the Union Army, leaving it bleeding and dying on the field of honor. Reid, who witnessed the collapse firsthand, described scenes of indescribable chaos as organized military units dissolved into panicked mobs of fleeing men. But even as half the Union Army disintegrated, one man stood firm: General George Thomas, holding the Union left near the Kelly farmhouse, refused to retreat despite the collapse of his right flank. The Rock of Chickamauga was about to earn his immortal nickname in the most desperate fighting of the war. The afternoon sun was sinking toward the western horizon, and the battle was far from over. As the Union center collapsed under Longstreet's devastating assault, General George Thomas found himself in command of what remained of the Army of the Cumberland's fighting spirit. From his position near Snodgrass Hill, the Virginia-born career soldier could see the gray tide flowing around both his flanks, threatening to engulf his entire corps. Lesser men might have ordered a retreat, but Thomas had earned his nickname, Pap, from soldiers who trusted him with their lives, and he would not abandon them now. The situation was desperate beyond description. Thomas's 14th Corps, along with scattered remnants from the shattered center, held a rough horseshoe-shaped line on the slopes of Snodgrass Hill and around the Kelly farmhouse. They were surrounded on three sides by triumphant Confederates who could smell victory in the smoke-filled air. Ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting by the minute, and there seemed to be no hope of reinforcement. Major General Gordon Granger, commanding the Reserve Corps several miles to the north, made a decision that would save the Union cause. Despite having no orders to move, and in direct violation of Rosecrans's explicit instructions to hold his position, Granger marched his 20,000 men toward the sound of the guns. "I am going to Thomas, orders or no orders," he declared to his staff, and by 4 o'clock his lead elements were climbing the back slope of Snodgrass Hill. The arrival of Granger's corps electrified Thomas's embattled defenders. The 89th Ohio, reduced to fewer than 50 men after 6 hours of continuous fighting, suddenly found fresh troops moving up beside them. Captain James Wood, the regiment's senior surviving officer, later wrote, "When we saw those boys coming up the hill, with their bayonets gleaming, we knew that Pap Thomas hadn't forgotten us. It was like seeing angels descending from heaven. One continuous roar, like standing next to a waterfall made of bullets. Boys were falling all around me, but we kept going because that's what soldiers do." The 2nd Confederate Column, composed of South Carolinians under General Micah Jenkins, attempted to flank the Union left but ran into an unexpected obstacle. Colonel John Wilder's mounted infantry, concealed in a grove of oak trees, opened fire with their Spencer-repeating rifles at point-blank range. The rapid-fire weapons created such a devastating crossfire that the entire Confederate advance ground to a halt within minutes. Meanwhile, the 3rd Column under General Jerome Robertson had actually broken through the Union line near the Kelly farmhouse, capturing 2 artillery pieces and driving the defenders back in disorder. For a few terrifying minutes, it appeared that Thomas's center might collapse just as it had the previous day. But the Union general had prepared for this contingency, holding back his last reserve, the 1st Brigade of the Regular Army under Colonel Oliver Shepard. The Regular Army Brigade, composed of professional soldiers rather than volunteers, counterattacked with clockwork precision. Their disciplined volleys and coordinated bayonet charge drove Robertson's Confederates back down the hill, recapturing the lost artillery and restoring the Union line. It was the last gasp of Confederate offensive power at Chickamauga. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Bragg's army had shot its bolt. The repeated assaults had cost the Confederates over 8,000 additional casualties, bringing their total losses to nearly 20,000 men, more than a quarter of their entire force. Regimental commanders lay dead beside their battle flags. Brigade organizations had ceased to exist, and whole divisions had been reduced to the strength of companies. Thomas, recognizing that the Confederate attacks were weakening, ordered his own counterattack. The Union forces, inspired by their successful defense, swept down from Horseshoe Ridge with a cheer that echoed across the battlefield. The demoralized Confederates, exhausted by 2 days of continuous fighting, began to fall back toward Chickamauga Creek. As evening approached on September 20th, the Battle of Chickamauga finally drew to its bloody close. The Confederates held the field, but at such a cost that their victory rang hollow. They had inflicted over 16,000 casualties on the Union forces, but they had suffered nearly 20,000 themselves, losses that the Confederacy could not afford. As documented in the final casualty reports published in the official records, Chickamauga had indeed lived up to its Cherokee name as the River of Death. Over 34,000 Americans had been killed, wounded, or captured in just 2 days of fighting, making it proportionally one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Civil War. General Thomas began his withdrawal toward Chattanooga that evening, his battered but unbroken army moving in good order despite their devastating losses. The Rock of Chickamauga had saved the Union cause in the Western Theater, preserving the army that would eventually drive to Atlanta and the sea. Behind them, the Georgia woods lay carpeted with the blue and gray bodies of men who had given their lives for their respective causes. The river of death had run its course, but the memory of those 2 September days would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Chickamauga had shocked the nation with its savagery, proving that even 3 years into the war, Americans were still capable of inflicting unimaginable carnage upon one another. The battle was over, but the war would continue for another year and a half, claiming hundreds of thousands more lives before the guns finally fell silent at a PPOMATTOX dot in the gathering twilight of September 20th, 1863. The Cherokee spirits must have wept to see their prophecy so terribly fulfilled. But the Confederates were not finished. Braxton Bragg, sensing that complete victory was within his grasp, ordered every available unit to assault Thomas's position. Wave after wave of gray-clad soldiers surged up the slopes of Snodgrass Hill, their rebel yells echoing through the forest like the cries of hunting wolves. The fighting reached a crescendo of violence that veteran soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. The 92nd Illinois, holding the extreme left of Thomas's line, found themselves fighting off attacks from 3 different directions. Simultaneously, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had enlisted in Chicago, organized a last-ditch defense around a cluster of boulders near the hilltop. With only 17 men remaining from his original company of 64, O'Brien held his ground for over an hour, his small band accounting for nearly 100 Confederate casualties before they were finally overwhelmed. Private Henry Schaefer of the 21st Wisconsin described the intensity of the fighting in a letter to his wife. "The rebels came at us like madmen, screaming and yelling fit to wake the dead. We shot them down in rows, but more kept coming. The ground was so thick with bodies that you could walk from one end of our line to the other without your feet touching earth." As evening approached, the Confederate attacks began to lose their momentum. Bragg's army had been fighting continuously for over 10 hours, and even veteran troops had limits to their endurance. More importantly, they had suffered staggering casualties in their repeated assaults against Thomas's prepared positions. The 3rd Confederate Corps alone had lost over 40% of its strength, while some brigades had been virtually annihilated. The turning point came around 6 o'clock when Colonel John Wilder's mounted infantry, armed with Spencer repeating rifles, struck the Confederate right flank near the Alexander farmhouse. The devastating firepower of the Spencer rifles, capable of firing 7 rounds, without reloading, caught the attacking Confederates completely by surprise. In less than 10 minutes, Wilder's men had shattered 2 Confederate brigades and captured over 300 prisoners. As documented in the post-battle reports published in Harper's Weekly, Thomas's stand on Snodgrass Hill had prevented what could have been the complete destruction of the Union Army of the Cumberland. The magazine's correspondent wrote, "General Thomas had transformed certain defeat into something approaching victory, his heroic stand preserving the Union cause when all seemed lost." As darkness finally brought an end to the first day's fighting, both armies settled into exhausted vigilance. The Confederates held most of the battlefield, but Thomas still controlled the vital roads leading back to Chattanooga. More importantly, he had preserved the core of the Union Army, giving Rosecrans time to reorganize and plan for the battles yet to come. The Rock had held firm, but the river of death continued to flow. September 20th dawned gray and ominous, with a heavy mist rising from the blood-soaked ground where over 16,000 Americans had fallen the previous day. The silence was almost more unnerving than the battle had been, broken only by the occasional groan of wounded men calling for water and the distant sound of entrenching tools as both armies prepared for another day of carnage. General Braxton Bragg stood on a small rise near his headquarters, surveying the battlefield through his field glasses as the morning mist slowly lifted. Victory had been so close the previous evening that he could almost taste it, but Thomas's stubborn defense had robbed him of complete triumph. Now, with a full night to reorganize, the Union forces might prove even more difficult to dislodge. Still, Bragg retained significant advantages. His army held most of the field. Union morale was shattered, and he had fresh troops arriving hourly from the railroad at Ringgold. The Confederate plan for the second day was relatively simple. General Leonidas Polk would attack the Union right at dawn, rolling up the Federal line from north to south. Once Polk had engaged the enemy's attention, Longstreet would launch another massive assault against the Union left and center, hoping to repeat the previous day's breakthrough. If all went well, the Army of the Cumberland would be destroyed before sunset, but the Union forces had not been idle during the night. General Thomas, now effectively commanding the army after Rosecrans's near collapse, had used the hours of darkness to construct a formidable defensive line along Horseshoe Ridge. His men had worked feverishly, felling trees, piling rocks, and digging rifle pits that would give them some protection against the coming storm. More importantly, General Granger's reserve corps had arrived in full strength, giving Thomas nearly 30,000 men with which to hold his position. The first Confederate attack came at dawn, led by General Benjamin Cheatham's division against the Union positions near the McDonald farmhouse. The 24th and 27th Tennessee, supported by Captain Moses White's battery, advanced through the morning mist with their characteristic rebel yell echoing across the valley. They struck the 82nd Indiana head-on, driving Colonel Morton Hunter's regiment back nearly 200 yards before running into a second line of Union defenders. What followed was 3 hours of the most sustained combat of the entire war. The fighting around the McDonald farm became a series of vicious attacks and counterattacks, with ground changing hands multiple times as exhausted soldiers grappled with bayonets, rifle butts, and bare fists. The 125th Illinois, holding a stone wall near the farmhouse, repelled 6 separate Confederate charges before finally being overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. Private Isaac Sherwood of the 11th Ohio would later write, "The Rebs came at us like they were possessed by devils. We shot them down as fast as we could load and fire, but they kept coming. When they finally broke our line, it was every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost." By 10 o'clock, Polk's assault had pushed the Union right back nearly a mile, but at a horrific cost. The Confederate attack had lost all momentum, with entire brigades reduced to company strength and regimental commanders lying dead beside their battle flags. More critically, the assault had failed to achieve its primary objective of rolling up the Union line. Thomas's men had bent, but not broken, falling back to prepared positions rather than collapsing en route. Longstreet, observing the fighting from his position on the Confederate right, could see that Polk's attack was losing steam. Old Pete knew that this might be his last chance to deliver the knockout blow that would destroy the Union Army and potentially end the war in the Western Theater. He had assembled an even larger assault force than the previous day, nearly 15,000 men organized into 3 assault columns that would strike the Union center simultaneously. As referenced in the detailed battle accounts published in Century magazine following the war. Longstreet's second assault represented the high-water mark of Confederate hopes in the Western Theater, a moment when the fate of the nation hung in the balance on a few acres of Georgia woodland. The stage was set for the climactic action of the battle. Around 11 o'clock, as storm clouds gathered overhead and the first drops of rain began to fall on the smoke-shrouded battlefield, Longstreet gave the order to advance. 15,000 Confederate soldiers rose from their positions and began what would be their final charge at Chickamauga. The River of Death was about to reach flood stage. The Confederate assault that began at 11:30 on the morning of September 20th represented the last desperate throw of the dice for Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. 15,000 men in 3 massive columns advanced through the rain-dampened Georgia woods, their battle flags sodden but still flying, their voices raised in the wild cry that had terrified Union soldiers from Bull Run to Gettysburg. This was to be the blow that would shatter the Army of the Cumberland once and for all. General Thomas, positioned near his command post on Horseshoe Ridge, watched the gray tide approach with the calm demeanor that had earned him the devotion of his men. The Rock of Chickamauga had spent the night positioning his remaining forces with mathematical precision. Every regiment had been placed to maximize defensive firepower, every battery sighted to create interlocking fields of fire, every possible escape route blocked to prevent another rout like the previous day's disaster. The 1st Confederate Column, led by General Evander Law's Alabama Brigade, struck the Union center with tremendous force. The men of the 4th Alabama, veterans of a dozen battles, surged up the slopes of Horseshoe Ridge with their bayonets fixed and their voices raised in the rebel yell. They collided with the 74th Indiana in a crash of steel and gunpowder that could be heard for miles. Colonel Charles Harker's Union Brigade, positioned in a slight depression near the ridge crest, opened fire when the Confederates were barely 50 yards away. The volley from 2,000 Springfield rifles created a wall of lead that no living thing could cross. The attacking Alabamians were cut down in rows, their bodies piling up like cordwood in front of the Union position. But still they came, stepping over their fallen comrades with grim determination. Private William Thompson of the 42nd Alabama later wrote, "We went up that hill like we were walking into the jaws of hell itself. The Yankees were shooting so fast it sounded like